Welcome to the Social Exchange Podcast. Today's guest is Kate Nicholson. Kate is a civil rights attorney. In the mid-90s, due to complications from surgery, she became unable to walk, stand, or even sit. She was in excruciating pain each day and couldn't leave her home, and she remained isolated in bed for 15 years. In this interview, Kate explains how, despite being isolated, she was able to create a purposeful, meaningful, and engaging and optimistic life. And she offers tips about how to do the same for those of us who are still only getting used to this new temporary way of life, sans social engagement. Just to get a sense of some of the things that Kate's up to, she's a civil rights attorney and an advocate for pain patients who have been affected by limitations on prescribing. She's done a TED Talk on this issue. She's a nationally recognized expert on the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. She also runs nonprofits related to pain patient advocacy and the arts, respectively. And she frequently writes op-eds for major publications, most recently in the LA Times and The Hill. And I should mention that when I finally got to meet Kate, I was already fascinated by her and her work and her life experience. I'd watched her impressive TED Talk that she gave a few years ago, and I was excited to speak with her. And this conversation, which was going to last 20 minutes or something, turned into something like a 4-hour conversation. And I really wouldn't have minded it lasting longer. First, I didn't know if she had the bandwidth for it, but also I had a plane to catch. All of that to say, you're going to enjoy hearing Kate speak, and you'll likely want to learn more about her, so I've provided ways to do so in the show notes. Also remember that this podcast is funded solely by donation, although I do want to give a shout out to Nunzio De Martino. He owns a tour business in Italy where he'll drive you around, teach you about the history of the region, and he shows you all the local hotspots, whether it's restaurants and attractions, touristy stuff, or if you want to see the lesser-known, interesting areas for excursions in Italy. And Nunzio was recently a guest on the show and told us about his experience living in lockdown right now in Italy. His business is currently completely frozen, of course. He's just taking care of his family, including 2 young daughters. And despite all the difficulty he's facing, in probably every single way, he thought that my show was doing a lot of good. And because he believed that, he decided to make a donation. I don't know. I just feel like you can't get more honest and kind than that. So I'm turning it back to him. His business is called Don Nunzio Limos, which I've linked to in the show notes. And when our pandemic begins to slow down, and when we're again able to travel safely, I highly, highly recommend that you reach out to him. And not just because he's a nice guy, but because he'll give you the best experience you could ask for as a traveler, whatever your preferences are. And of course, I have to thank all of those who have been faithfully supporting us on Patreon, and I'm going to do so about halfway through the episode, if that's all right. I've taken up a lot of time in the intro already. So stay tuned for that, and please enjoy today's interview with Kate Nicholson. Thanks for joining me, Kate.
It's such a pleasure.
I've been really trying to stay connected with people during our current pandemic, and I've been really trying to find reasons for optimism as well, which it hasn't been as easy as usual. And having you as a guest, we were just saying, is like a 2-for-1 deal for me and our listeners. Because for one thing, we've been in contact for a while, or at least aware of one another on social media. And then I met you at a conference earlier this year and was really, truly fascinated with everything you were telling me about. And it was like a hold my calls kind of a situation. It was really interesting to talk to you. You know, everything you went through in the past, your attitude, your work, your advocacy, everything is just deeply interesting. And in addition to all of that, you recently published an article apropos of our country's, our world's current dilemma. And it's about how to deal with negative kickbacks of self-isolating. And by my way of thinking, you're in a unique position to offer such advice. So we'll get into all of that just before I dig too deep into it. Will you tell people who you are and what keeps you busy during the day? And please do give us a sense of your relevant background, and including your own personal experience and some of the things even that you've had to endure over time.
Sure. My name is Kate Nicholson. I am by professional background a civil rights attorney. I spent most of my career protecting civil rights in the U.S. Department of Justice. I now primarily advocate for the rights of people with pain and for pain treatment in the context of the opioid crisis, and for the rights of other people who use drugs and particularly need access to medications that are less available today because of the limitations that we're placing on on opioids in particular, but on controlled substances in general. I recently started an organization that's advocating for better research and treatment of pain. And that's sort of my professional background. My personal story, and the reason I got into the area of pain, is that fairly shortly into my career, I became someone in quite severe pain. I suffered a surgical injury to part of my spinal cord, the nerve plexus that feeds into my spinal cord, and became rather suddenly unable to sit, stand, or walk, and in a lot of pain for the better part of 15 years. And I figured out how to continue to live my life. Part of it was the good fortune of happening to work in a job and in a division that was then enforcing the very newly enacted Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. So they were willing to accommodate me because it was an odd disability. Since I couldn't sit or stand, there was no wheelchair that would accommodate me. So I ended up having to be largely bedridden and figure out sort of how to work and carry on my life in that way, which I did with brand new technology then called video teleconferencing. This was the early 90s. I convinced the Government Services Administration to pay for a pilot project to see if you could use video teleconferencing to continue sort of negotiations, because I was halfway through some pretty major settlement negotiations. And when I could argue in court locally, I argued from a folding reclining law chair. And basically ended up overseeing cases at DOJ and all over the country because it was something that I could do through technology and training people using videos and stuff. So is that enough of an entree?
That is, I mean, it's all remarkable. And when you were going through all of that, which is plenty to endure, did you have a sense that things were going to get better, or was it fairly open-ended, sort of like our situation is now?
Well, the interesting thing that I think you pointed out about me is that I'm sort of absurdly optimistic. When it first happened, I just sort of went through the medical system assuming I would get better. I really did. And like many people with chronic pain, I went from specialist to specialist and accrued all kinds of bizarre diagnoses, from MS to ankylosing spondylitis, and was put on all kinds of different medications. And I never really got better. But I at one point, I started to get much worse. And I remember being pretty astonished by it because it really hadn't occurred to me that it would get worse, which says something about my mental frame, I suppose. So no, I mean, I never knew, it's easy to say in retrospect that it lasted, 15, 20 years or so. But I never knew when things would change, whether things would change. And even since I've gotten much healthier, I mean, I moved out to Colorado and learned to walk again, and then my spine collapsed. And my legs stopped working again. And I had to get my spine rebuilt with sort of multi-level artificial disc replacement. And the theory was that in lying down for so many years, once I got up and was weight bearing, the vertebrae were just sort of fractured and there wasn't anything really holding it together. But when you have a long-term illness like this, it's never a pure cure, I am much better and I am very grateful for how I'm doing right now, but it's still kind of a day at a time.
So you've not only experienced what some might consider a personal crisis of connection, maybe. I mean, you've had to spend a lot of time on your own, but you've also been helping people who have suffered in both. Yeah, I mean, you worked in the HIV and AIDS crises,
yes,
overdose crisis. You've managed somehow to stay, as you just mentioned, incredibly optimistic. And your article, which I'll be referring to, I think, for the remainder of the episode, if I say your article, people will know it's this one, is called Suggestions for Dealing with Isolation from Someone Who Spent Many Years Bedridden. You offer 4 major ideas about how to stay sane while in isolation. And so the subtext there is sort of take it from me. And then you break these into sort of smaller component parts. I wonder if we could just discuss those 4 pillars that you built.
Sure. One of the things I really wanted to do was to let people know how important sort of social engagement is. I begin the article by telling a story that is a true story that happened about 3 weeks after I first became bedridden, in which my friends all went to the Shenandoahs hiking for the day, something I normally would have done with them. And I was unable to, obviously, since I was at home in bed. But that evening, they sort of brought their day back to me. They brought wildflowers and freshly harvested apples and lots of food to make a nice dinner. And then they described sort of their day in nature. And we had very much the kind of time together as we always did. So it enabled me to feel like a lot of things hadn't changed, even though for me, a lot had. And I use that sort of as a metaphor or an example for how to sort of continue to live a life. I think many people with disabilities realize that in order to be part of society, you still want to follow your passions and do the things that are meaningful to you. You just might have to do them a little differently. And so in that sense, I could still have people in. Today, it's a little harder with physical distancing to have people in. But I guess the first thing that I say is sort of do your thing, just do it differently. And that is relying largely at this point on technology. So I have been involved in virtual dinner parties. A friend of mine actually who does this great project called Looking for America, in which she sort of hosts art events all over the country and brings together people who normally don't talk to each other. It's really focused on immigration and what it means to be American. But she's really sort of hosting dinners. And tomorrow night, we're having our first version of this virtually. So with sort of broken down chat rooms and everything. So we'll see how that works. But, I think it's really important to keep doing what's meaningful to you. And I talk a little bit about telecommuting and how awkward it is to initially start using, even though digital technology is ubiquitous and most of us are quite used to being on our computers and our phones, we're not used to having to rely on that in its entirety.
There's something actually sort of, how would you, I guess taboo is not the right word, but there's this thought that even though we all sort of do rely on them for so much, that you ought not to. And now we're spinning that we probably should.
Yeah, well, I think there is a taboo, and in some sense, it's maybe a good one. And that we have become too screen focused and forget to actually have a conversation with the people who are sitting in front of us. And so I think there's a valid point there. But in times of crisis, when we have to sort of be further apart from one another, it is important to use the tools that we have. And you can have, I've been involved in virtual cocktail parties and virtual dinners, and I've used this as an opportunity to reach out to people in other cities who I don't see as often, or people even who I haven't seen for many years, but I've wanted to follow up with, as well as people I know are sort of struggling, whether it be with anxiety or just being isolated. So it's a good tool. There are ways you can break the ice if it feels awkward. I mentioned in the article a law professor friend, because they're all having to teach their classes now online, who had students introduce their pets who were in the house during the first class, just to kind of warm things up a little and make it less awkward and less cold, because technology can feel a little cold. But I think it's important to continue to reach out and to people, but also to sort of cultural and social engagement. And so I listed in my article lots and lots and lots and lots of free things that you can do online. Everything from, touring 1,500 art museums or to and the art collections online, to sort of the Met Opera and Berlin Philharmonic are having live streaming, as is, I think, the Royal Shakespeare Company. And so there are lots of things that I feel like the cultural community has really stepped up. There are musicians doing live streams all the time. There are many, many books that are available for free, whether on Audible or on the New Public Library website. And so my point was just to sort of reach out to the thing and lean into the things that matter to you and that will sustain you in a meaningful way.
Can you think of a time when technology wasn't as readily available? Because indeed it wasn't in the 90s. Do you remember feeling like you were losing out on something that you usually did, and then over time you figured out a way to adapt so that you could, as you say, lean into?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, although technology was definitely not available as readily when I was in college, really by the early 90s, email and, like I said, video teleconferencing were really pretty available. They were brand new. And I mean, at least email was less brand new, but I mean, this video teleconferencing was really a sort of hot new thing. So, I was very lucky, I think, that it happened at the time that it did, because if I hadn't had email and those options, I wouldn't have been able to do my job. I mean, I definitely became the sort of disembodied voice, in the middle of the conference room table because I was, it wasn't always video. Often it would just be a conference call. And I didn't get to see people and they didn't get to see me. So that was certainly a reality and a regular reality. But I actually felt quite lucky that the sort of coincidence of technology and change occurred, just as I felt quite lucky that I was working in a workplace that would accommodate me, because I was lucky that my friends and my life and my job were able to shift along with me. I don't think that's always been true, and I don't think that's true for everyone. I mean, there were certainly people I talked to who had jobs at smaller employers who were fired if they couldn't come into work. And so, yes, I'm optimistic, and I do try to adapt, but I also was fairly privileged in a lot of ways. And that's another thing I talk about in this essay, because I've given talks on resilience and healing. And one of the things I talk about is how we do build resilience, or how we can build resilience. And the number one most important thing for building it is having social and cultural support, at least according to social scientists. They talk about, and I mentioned this in the article, people in solitary confinement, those in the most extreme circumstances of isolation, still figuring out how to communicate with people around them by tapping on the walls. And they suggest that we can all sort of develop a tapping response, or learn how to adapt to our circumstances. But the other part of resilience that I came to understand, and I think I always intuitively knew this, was that it has so much more to do with what comes to us from the outside than really what's inside of us. I mean, there's this whole sort of movement to sort of build resilience. There's this idea that people like me are inspiration stories. And, there are a lot of people who are very curious to figure out why some people adapt and why some don't. And what I found when I was doing research for some of these talks is that a lot of it really does depend on things like your circumstances. So I was, already fairly privileged, fairly educated, had a good job, had a job that was willing to accommodate me. It turns out that things like whether money comes in quickly after a natural disaster, or whether you have, stable housing, or even whether you're part of a group that is subjected to discrimination, really affects your survival and your sense of resilience.
Yeah, circumstances, of course, matter. And if people
Yes.
are born to or find themselves in perpetually difficult circumstances, or a perpetually heavy cognitive load, it seems at least exponentially more difficult to find silver linings. But
I think it is. It's because the system gets overloaded. I mean, they talk about sort of, it's like being on a seesaw, and you have your circumstances on one side, your background life circumstances, and, the things that happen to you on the other. And if you already have circumstances that make your, or brain chemistry that doesn't overload or get triggered easily because of prior trauma, be they socioeconomically based traumas or traumas that you've experienced personally, then your system can handle these negative inputs. But when you don't have that baseline to begin with, then it just becomes so much more triggering, negative events do.
right. So we'll move forward with the understanding that you are certainly not saying just be like me. And in
No,
fact,
exactly.
you almost want to move the opposite direction of saying that. But there, I don't see an alternative to sort of trying to manufacture better circumstances, or utilize resources, or find new ones in the ways that you're suggesting. If we haven't crept into this concept yet, the second piece that you mentioned was that you ought to continue to connect with people and to be active. I think that's actually kind of deceptively profound. People sort of know that they should be connected, but that could mean so many different things, and that can happen in so many different ways. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that if we haven't exhausted it. Thank you for letting me interrupt the show for just a moment to remind you that the Social Exchange podcast is only possible because of the support that we receive from our listeners. To support the show, please subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast app. And if you're already subscribed, it would really, really help if you'd rate and or review us on your podcast app. And to make a donation to the show, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/thesocialexchange. Even the minimum possible contribution of $2 goes a long way for us. So again, go to patreon.com/thesocialexchange. Thank you so much to all who have done so far. To my family members who contribute, Linda Rhodes, Tom Rhodes, Pete and Sue Matthew, I love you all and thank you. And thanks to everyone else who supports us on Patreon. Nuncio De Martino, Susan Lennon, James Stacks, Chris L., Leon Nahufahu, Sherry Chandler, D.D. Stout, Christopher Hanlon, Andre Pompel, Rick Barnett, Carter Vermont, which is a nonprofit addiction recovery organization here in Vermont, Ann Earl, Inigo, John Holt, Layla, Mary Kay Villaverde, Michelle, Nancy, Sean, Regina Ferguson, Tim Tucker, Christian, Kathleen Cochran, Marjorie Israel, Diane T., and Trevor. Thank you all so much again for believing in what we do and supporting us. And if you want to be on this list, make sure to go to patreon.com/thesocialexchange. Now back to the show.
Yeah, I mean, so the first sort of thing I talked about was just sort of, doing your thing, whether it's your job or the cultural things you enjoy and resources to make that happen. The second is sort of actually continuing to engage with people and check on people and talk to them. And again, that has to be enabled by technology and the phone at this point, or if you can still get outside, which I can in Colorado, and I feel enormously grateful for, and can responsibly practice physical distancing. It is really important to stay active as well. And so I sort of suggest that people set up dates, even if it feels arbitrary. Schedule talks with people, schedule walks with people, but because the other part of this is that it's important to connect because that does build resilience, and it's important to stay active because that helps us stay mentally and physically healthy. But it's also sort of when everything is a little bit uncertain, having a schedule helps too, and having events that you can look forward to can really be useful in establishing a new reality, because we're all sort of improvising right now and we don't really know what's next. And there's this sort of foreboding sense of dread as we know something is coming. And I think it's important to, live the life that we're used to living as much as we possibly can, just a little differently, and to make conscious efforts to schedule things so that we do start to set up a routine and set up interactions.
And as important as routine is, I have an anxiety that if I were to stay in place as often as I have to now, just to be responsible for an extended period of time, there'd be this oppressive sense of sameness, running out of things to do. So you did mention that novelty is actually also important. If you can get a routine going, it's also important not to only live by routine, but perhaps actually you didn't say that anyone has to do anything, but one might try.
Right. They're just suggestions. Yeah. No, I mean, I think trying something new during an unusual time is also a great thing. I mean, I did that in a couple ways. I mentioned I started drawing when I was bedridden. I now help run an art nonprofit locally in my spare time, and art is a big passion of mine. And it wasn't something in my life before I was in pain. And so, whether it's now you suddenly have time to write your novel, or now you suddenly have time to do some spring cleaning or gardening or whatever it is, play the guitar more. I don't know. There are things that are meaningful to different people. And there are things that we've always been curious to try. And I'd say if you find yourself bored, it's a good time to try something new. The other new thing that I tried that I think is also important is to be willing to sort of lean into the quiet and the silence and the sameness. Because the first part of my article was all this sort of cultural distractions, which I think are wonderful and engaging and important. And you want to keep that variety in your life, but it's also okay to go inside and, and it's also okay to, to practice things like deep breathing and things like visualization and things like meditation, and to sort of experience boredom and silence, because there are treasures there as well. That's something else. I mean, you can tell probably from talking to me, but or anyone who's been around me can get a sense that I'm a very extroverted person and not a particularly quiet one. So wasn't really a natural meditator, but I did do a lot of meditation and continue to every day, have a regular practice now, because it gave me a sense of peace in some very difficult circumstances, and because even over time it really helped calm my nervous system. And I had severe chronic pain, and so that sort of amps up your whole nervous system. So it became a really important, in many ways, coping technique and tool for me. And I suggest lots of apps that are out there, and free meditation classes. And, there's so many different ways to do it. But, Brodsky had a really interesting essay many years ago about boredom and why you needed to be bored. And I think that in a society where we do have everything at the ready, there are real values in sort of being quiet and feeling bored and taking the moment to go inside and see what's there.
There's a lot of hurry up and wait, I feel like, in our current situation. And I've never heard the concept of circle of influence, circle of concern addressed so often as I have recently. And it's sort of like we have these tools that exist parallel to us and can be slapped in the face with them now. Like, well, there are things you can control, there's things you can't control. Don't worry about the things you can't control. And I feel like that could be really empty advice if you don't have some sort of ability or routine, or at least thought that it could be okay to tune into yourself and tune into just what's going on in front of you.
I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, one of the things that you learn in meditation is sort of staying present, and not, and being aware of what's, happening inside of you and your reactions, but not necessarily indulging them or reacting to them or getting into a panic. And, as you know, from the work that you've done, public health crises, can also really inspire fear that can bring out stigma and the worst in us. And I think, both for sort of personal edification, but also for each other, we have to find our ways of staying grounded, and not giving into panic. And I realize as we're talking about this, for some reason it was even easier to write about it. It does all sound a little pat, a little reduced, go online, do a virtual cocktail party. It sounds, a little privileged and a little pat, but these things actually do make a difference. And they really are just adapted ways of conducting the same life that you've always had. And that's my biggest advice, is like, to the extent that you can, to the fullest extent that you can, live the way you always have.
I like the way you said that, because this is what I was trying to say, but couldn't spit it out when I was talking about a certain level of taboo around being on technology all the time. I don't know if this is just idiosyncratic. I have a feeling now that I have an excuse to do some of the things that I've wanted to do for a while, but have felt held back, like socially, like I'm obligated to something else, and I didn't have time for them.
That's lovely. So this time is giving you permission, and I think that's a really powerful thing. I mean, I actually, one of the very indulgent things that I did when I was bedridden and after I had paid off all my student loans and suddenly had some money, was started to collect art, because it gave me so much pleasure. And there was a part of me that felt like, I should be giving my money away, like to charity. There's something really self-indulgent, even though you're supporting artists, there's still something kind of indulgent about it. But you know what? I felt okay about it, because I felt like, well, shit, I'm stuck in bed. I can't move. I'm in a lot of pain. I deserve this.
Right.
So I do think extreme circumstances can give us a sense of permission. And maybe we shouldn't need that, but I agree with you. It gives us a sense that we can try some of these things and not feel like we're being irresponsible by doing it.
The last point you mentioned in your article was that one thing that you can do to keep yourself occupied and not feel the hurt of isolation is to reach out to people, and not just reach out to people, but perhaps even reach out to people in the greatest need.
I mean, that to me is the most important part of the article, and really is my sort of modus operandi as a person, and in this particular moment as well. And what I wanted to say is just that it's really important to remember that even though everyone's anxious, and even though everyone's isolated, and even though everyone is suffering to some degree, we are not suffering equally. We just aren't. And whether it be because of people's, jobs or economic circumstances or health hardship, people are sick, People have anxiety or other, there are all kinds of reasons. People are older and don't have a lot of people in their life. There are all kinds of reasons why there are some people who are far more vulnerable than others in this situation. And so one of the things that you can do is to reach out, to those people. And, I've done things as tiny as giving donations to the local food bank when the schools were closed down, because I was aware that, so many families rely on the food that the school districts provide, or, helping deliver medical supplies. There are so many, or checking on friends who have anxiety. And I actually gave a little shout out to people like you who offered counseling services for free. I know you did that on you mentioned on Twitter, people in Vermont. I think we all have unique things that we can give in this moment. And I think it's sort of our obligation in a way to do that, to sort of step up to it. And sometimes it's, you feel immediate sense of richness from it. And sometimes it's really hard. I think I mentioned to you before we started talking, I'm working on a legal and ethical paper right now on medical rationing, because that's probably pretty inevitable that some people are going to live and some people are going to die, and pretty tough decisions are going to be made about who gets ventilators and beds and things like that, based on things like age and disability. And since my background is in non-discrimination, I'm really talking about the ethical principles and, the fact that we shouldn't throw the non-discrimination ideas out the window when we do that, because we can really overreach. And that's been, I feel like it's been an important thing to write about, because it's going to happen, but it doesn't really feel good to me.
Yeah. Even for your own well-being, not just like a reciprocal altruistic way. Do you feel like it's a net good in your life that you're doing it, or do you feel like it has the potential to just completely exhaust you only?
No, I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't think it. I'm a big believer. My whole life, I think, is motivated by trying to give back. I mean, that's my passion. That's what feeds me. So it's definitely, I think, something that is helpful to me. It's just been a little harder than some of the other things that I have worked on. These are really hard choices that we're going to have to make.
I'm asking because I've just noticed small things about the way that I'm acting now differently than I normally do, or maybe just at a different scale. Things sort of happening all at once. We're getting so much information thrown at us. There are implications about the information, whether you're getting the right information or not, about what I'm going to do for my family or what we should do together, the decisions we ought to make. And I've noticed myself stepping into this role of really just exhaustively peeling through information and running through scenarios in my mind and trying to talk through in a reasonable way what our best bet is. And I'm doing that with other people too. And the reason this is different for me is that I like doing things like that, but I also like to give myself plenty of time to recoup and to rest. And I still think that's important, but I find myself digging into that rest recouping time because I'm already on edge and I feel like I can't relax. And so I'm putting that to good use as just doing something constructive, and it doesn't feel good. Sometimes the truth really feels bad. The fact that there are, two decisions that you were saying that need to be made, neither of them are good, but you have to figure out which is the best. That seems terrible and like a way of spending time that could really just send somebody, through the window. But I guess I don't know where I'm going here, but I think if you have the capacity for it, it makes sense to me that it could be a boon in a situation like this where there's already an underlying anxiety all the time anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think in this case, it was funny. I was talking to one of my co-authors today about it, and she was saying, usually I feel really good about the work I'm doing, and this is hard. And so I am taking more, I am remembering to meditate, or I am remembering to take a walk or cook some, bake something nice for my family. Because, you can get information overload, analysis overload so easily. I mean, I think that's true in general. And I try and filter as much as I can the information I take in. I mean, I've never even owned a television. I really do try and be very conscious about when and how I take in information and the information that I synthesize, but because it can become overwhelming. Even though some of the work I've done with chronic pain patients, I hear from desperate people who are suicidal and suffering every day. And that's had its challenges too. But for some reason, this feels, a little harder. I suppose it's because thinking about who gets to live and who gets to die in such a deliberate way is a particularly gruesome.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be talking about optimism, but it's a particularly challenging thing. And yet, if we don't think about it consciously and have good principles laid out for how we're going to do that, then a lot of people who shouldn't be sacrificed will be. So it's important. So I think for me, it's more just, we all have to, I think it is important for us to reach out and think about our society, and we all have to contribute what we can. I mean, I'm not a medical doctor. I can't, be on the front lines and help save someone's life. What I can do, what I can do. And I think, even though it might be useful for me to, run to the grocery store for someone, and I still may do that, and may help in practical ways, there are probably other ways that I can bring my background to bear that are going to help more people. And so that's really my litmus test, I suppose.
I know what you mean about we got off the trail of optimism, but it really is best case scenarios. And I guess maybe that's one of the reasons you're able to tolerate such difficult topics, is that you're thinking about horrible scenarios, but understanding that there's a best case.
Right. Absolutely. And really trying to appeal to our best instincts. I mean, I think that's the most important thing going forward, especially as things get really challenging, and that because fear can, sort of hijack our best instincts. And I think best case scenario and really the appropriate ways to think about things can really shape, how we respond. On the other hand, fear mongering and some of the political responses can go in the other direction as well.
Kate, do you think I left out anything that you wanted to chat about in this talk?
No, I mean, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about we can do that another time, the chronic pain stuff and what policies. I mean, we did get some policies changed in the COVID situation, so that at least the DEA has relaxed requirements of, normally these days you have to go in if you are someone who uses buprenorphine for an opioid use disorder or an opioid for pain or many other kinds of controlled substances, you'd have to go in for physical appointments every month and go through certain protocols. And so the DEA is now allowing the use of telemedicine for prescribing controlled substances, and is also said that if a physician or clinician has already examined someone once, they don't have to even have telemedicine each month. They can actually prescribe using other means. And so that's a slightly relaxation of standards. I mean, the problem is that because there are laws in many states that still block people from being able to get prescriptions easily, it's still a sort of ongoing fight. Because of course, one of the recommendations I should have said to begin with is, that we have enough prescription, we have enough medication for sheltering in place and things like that.
Actually, if it's okay, can we spend a little bit more time on this? Because I have sort of a new subset of my audience right now, which is all of my high school students, because as we're on lockdown here and schools are closed, we're doing remote learning. So some of them will be tuning in. So just, I'll be potted, and maybe you would even do a better job, but suffice it to say that people who have been dealing with chronic pain and have been using opioid painkillers as a way, among other things, to responsibly deal with their pain, often horrendous pain. The idea that because opioids in and of themselves have some property that's addicting people, we have seen large institutions put out suggestions, even mandates, that people prescribe less, and that has affected a lot of people who really need them. In a strange way, because we're in a crisis, those regulations have sort of relaxed a little bit. Is that a fair?
In the tiniest way, yeah. I mean, what's happened, as you know, that it's really been a terrible situation for people in pain who use opioids. It's sort of been a danger of the correction or overcorrection to what was seen as liberal prescribing. But 4 out of 5 primary care physicians now say that they won't even treat a new patient who comes to them using opioids. Or at least they're reluctant to, and something like 41% won't treat them at all. And so we're starting to see a lot of bias, sort of like the kind of bias that I saw in the early part of my career. One of my big cases early on was ended up going to the US Supreme Court, and it was people with HIV and AIDS who were being turned away from medical care. And that was happening in a pretty rampant way in those days. And I feel like we're starting to see that now with respect to people with chronic pain or even people with an opioid use disorder who use buprenorphine. There are people who are not being treated just for primary care by physicians, which is a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a violation of the law, but it's still happening. The other thing that's happening is that people are being very quickly cut off of their ability to take of their medication. And that's a pretty dangerous thing. There's lots of studies, about 4 or 5 of them that have come out in the last year, showing that, just destabilizing someone's dosage actually puts them at like a 3-fold higher risk of an overdose. So we're actually, with respect to this subset of the population, we're actually in some ways causing some of the behavior we're trying to eliminate. And then there's just an enormous amount of suffering. I hear from people all the time who can no longer work and support their families and who are in a tremendous amount of pain because they can't get the medication that they've relied on in many cases for decades. And so that's been some of my primary work. And I have managed to work to get some policies changed. I mean, as you know, a lot of this started when the CDC issued guidance for prescribers in 2016. And I met with them this past year, and they have clarified that their guidelines being misapplied and are in the process of redoing their guideline. But the problem is that it's been misapplied in almost every state in the, more than half the states in the United States. It's been misapplied at so many by major pharmacy policies, major insurers, and at so many levels of the healthcare system that it's challenging to dismantle. We've also fought back against other limits, like in Oregon, they were going to make a change that basically took about 100,000 people who were on Medicaid off of their medication, and we got that stopped. And so that's a lot of what I have been working on, is sort of educating people in policymakers about sort of the nuance of the situation and people's genuine needs.
Do you have any sense that people are less trusting of institutions like the CDC right now, just when we need them to be, by virtue of them messing up and writing guidelines that are easily misinterpreted like this?
Well, I think some people, for sure. And I think you and I are hyper aware of a subset of the community that's been so affected by those guidelines. And so I do think for that group of people, there is less trust in the CDC. But I have to say, to some degree, to their credit, many aspects of the guidelines were not problematic. There were just a few really bad recommendations. And even on the face of the guidance, they said that the recommendations were based on poor and low quality evidence. And those are really the aspects of the guidance that have been misapplied by policymakers who were sort of in a rush to try and solve everything and made these recommendations law. So there were problems with the CDC's guideline. I mean, they did not really conduct a full and thorough vetting. I mean, I had to oversee major regulations at the Department of Justice. And even though the CDC doesn't have the same level of requirement for notice and comment rulemaking, there are protocols that you go through. And, leading into this guideline, they barely had public comment. So there were problems for certain with the development of the guideline. But at the same time, they were also working in a public health emergency where overdose deaths had been ignored for far too long and feeling pressure to do something. And there are things that are useful in it. So I tend to be a little less conspiracy theorist about the CDC than some, although I understand why some people feel that way about it. I'm not sure that beyond the drug policy world, people are as aware of what the CDC did on this particular issue, and they think of them sort of more broadly in terms of what they've done in the past. And I have to say, like when I was litigating HIV cases in the 90s, they were our expert. I mean, they were on the good side. They were the ones saying, with universal precautions, there isn't a great risk, and you have to look at the science, and you shouldn't just stigmatize people with HIV and AIDS and drop them. So, it's a big institution. I do think if you want to step back from that, there's a general distrust of institutions in our country right now, for many sense, for good reason, right? So I don't want to, say that I'm applauding all institutions, but I think probably with respect to the CDC, we're more aware of it because of the world in which we operate.
Back to the optimism that we're trying to run with, do you have any sense now that since, even though it took a pandemic of great proportions to change rules, are you optimistic that a change in guidelines, however slight, is a wave that you could ride into the future in hoping to relax guidelines around inpatients?
I mean, I think there are always sort of silver linings to these kinds of crises. I mean, some environmentalists have written some interesting things about it, and I think so far the relaxation has been so slight that I don't yet see any kind of profound change coming from it, from the pandemic in particular. But it is always good to look for silver linings and opportunities in difficult times, for certain. And I think there is also some cause for optimism just if you really look at the evolution of what's happening in China and the fact that when we have put in safe measures, people are seeing fewer new cases and things like that, just in terms of the COVID crisis in general.
Presumably the world's going to regain some sense of balance and composure, and we will be back to connectivity with relevant channels of life. But there's no rules to say that isolation can't happen to a person at any given time, as you know full well, for reasons perhaps beyond one's control. And so what I like about your suggestions today is that they apply, I think, to any person encountering any life-changing events that may force them into a state of isolation, right? That's not just hypothetical. You lived it. I just want to say thanks for sharing your experience and sharing your wisdom with people. But I do like to indulge my listeners if they feel like they didn't get enough Kate today already. How can they find you?
Can find me on Twitter at speakingaboutpain.com, or at kate@katemnicholson.com, and that's about it.
People can find links to your work in the show notes. I just want to say again, Kate, I know that, just as we speak, you're going through a lot. And despite that, you took the time to talk to me and to my audience, and very intelligently, you were very upbeat, very optimistic. And I think that what you provided us with today is a little bit of hope that we can get through some really uncertain times. So thank you again.
It's my pleasure. It's always good to talk to you.